The end of the Elbaf flashback is here. King Harold has condemned himself, Ida has departed from this world, and now it falls to Loki to murder his father for the sake of his mother's legacy. But before we get into anything truly horrorsome, the opening 2 pages of this chapter, they're actually quite lovely. And I think that despite what they lead into, they show us a good glimpse of the future. We have a bunch of wonderful reactions from humans, assumedly of well-government nations, who do actually feel much more safe with the stories of the giants who joined the Marines protecting them, which we saw in one panel of the last chapter. This right here, this is the birth of the giant squad. And the humans, they're likely not talking about Harold himself, because remember, he is masquerading as a lurking monster in the mist. No one really knows what he's doing, not the humans, not the citizens of Elbaf, no one. But I suppose this is one of those necessary reminders that most people in the One Piece world do actually believe in the world government, at least at this point in time. And they are nowhere near close to seeing the extent of evil that is in command of it. And so Harold is actually making much more rapid progress towards his goals than he was previously. However, there's a pretty big however here, because these happy pages come with the context of Harold quite literally having made a deal with the devil. And it's that classic fable of everything looking amazing at first, good decision making, and then all too soon, the devil comes to collect his part of the deal. Which is not good, but what this does show is proof of concept, that giants can win the hearts and minds of humans. And I especially like the panels in this chapter that focus on trade. Particularly this one here, because that's a very familiar face. This man is Deep Sea Currents Umit, one of the underworld emperors, who is transporting precious woods from Elbaf. And this is actually the second flashback in a row that Umit has been present in, because it was his enterprise that transported all of Vegapunk's lab materials to Egghead Island in the Kuma flashback. And he's also currently the one who Lafitte of the Blackbeard Pirates is targeting in the modern day. So he's one of these weirdly integral One Piece characters who we just never focus on. And it isn't explicitly stated, but I'm pretty sure that the logs Umit is transporting are Adamwood, which would be one of, if not the only batch that has ever made its way into the outside world. Because this period of friendly relations with Elbaf lasts for less than a year, and then Elbaf closes off again. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that there is a non-0% chance that the wood we see in this chapter is what goes onto the black market and is eventually sourced by Frankie to construct the Thousand Sunny. So we could be seeing an unexpected Thousand Sunny cameo in this chapter. But look, Harold, I think he has the exact right idea here. I've criticized his decision making recently, but I do love the idea of building these fun cruise or tour ships for humans to come and visit Elbaf. And I would definitely expect to see that happen in the future, maybe during an Elbaf cover story once the Straw Hats have left. But in terms of civilization, Elbaf is on the verge of a full-blown culture victory. And I think that's what makes Ida's death in this chapter a little easier to bear than most flashback deaths. Usually we've got our characters passing away in situations that look completely unsalvageable, rather grim, or with only the tiniest glimmer of hope, like say Rocinante giving a nice big smile, knowing that at the very least Trafalgar Law was going to live. And Ida is an interesting case because she's actually already passed away by the time that this chapter starts, and we go into a flashback within a flashback. I still think it's incredibly heartbreaking though, especially because Oda, he goes and uses the trope of speaking with the dying person about future travel plans. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I just know that I've seen this countless times in other media, and it always hits me right in the feels. But actually, for some One Piece related examples, it hits me right in the bonnies, because it reminds me of Kuma's promise to travel the world with his daughter, and this lingering adventurous spirit is quite common throughout the series, like Roger's desire to have lived in Joy Boy's time and explore the world that he got to traverse. It's a very hopeful way to go, even on your deathbed, continuing to look into the future rather than linger on any regrets and such. And look, from Ida's perspective, her own personal dawn of the world has already happened. She's lived long enough to see this complete transformation on Elbaf, and sure, bad things do happen from here, some real bad things. But we know from having visited Elbaf in the modern day that Ida's influence is still very much alive and well. Even after the death of Harold, Elbaf didn't fall into a state of despair and revert back to its war-focused traditions and all that. Not at all. Elbaf, it endured, it carried on the will of Harold and the will of Ida, because it is almost entirely thanks to Ida. Now, having said that, Ida does have some very important last words, and I really like what she said about admiring the spirit of Elbaf, the warrior's pride, because Ida stresses that not everything should be thrown out of the window. And this is one of the key themes that we've been dealing with all throughout this arc, because peace and progress, yes, it is lovely, but if you completely abandon the way of the warrior, then you're not going to be able to defend your peace and your progress. And That's where a character like Colin comes in. To me, Colin is the encapsulated future of Elbaf. He's very much shunned among his age group because he does want to embody this warrior's pride. And I would say that that's not incompatible with peace, it just depends who or what you're fighting for, which is why I suspect that long after One Piece is over, Colin is going to be the one to inherit his generation of the giant warrior pirates or whatever they are at that point. There's more talk about tradition as well, particularly about the fact that the old ways of Elbaf is what prevented Ida and Harold from getting married. But Ida, she's so good. She gives a perfect answer to this by transitioning into talking about Loki. Because as much as Ida would have loved to have been Harold's queen and lived happily ever after, if that had come to pass, then Loki would not exist. And that is a big problem because Ida considers Loki to be her son. Ida never needed the official titles or the official marriage certificate or anything because she knew that the feelings were there. And I don't know if this is a controversial opinion, but I feel much worse for Loki than I think anyone else in this chapter. This little man, or I guess big man now, never actually little man, he was always quite big, he spent his whole life trying to deny a need for love and acceptance, and the moment that he does finally fully embrace Ida as his mother, she goes and dies, and he's not even able to be there in her final moments. He's sitting in a very big jail for destroying Brewer's Village, and we also have a close-up of him tipping his helmet down, and this is being compared to that moment during Wano where Joseph from CP0 tips his hat to the memory of Guernica, who he thought had just sacrificed himself to interrupt the fight between Luffy and Kaido. And what Loki's doing, I guess it could be something like that, but my reading of it was that he was pulling his helmet down to cover his eyes, which is more symbolic than anything because his eyes are already covered by bandages. But it feels like Loki disconnecting again, putting that mask back on, and he's probably ready to embrace being the villain of Elbaf again, and to go full force into that Rox Dizebek philosophy. Because while we do see Ida and Harold's work being massively successful, at least until what's about to happen, Loki's point of view is very different. And whilst Elbaf is thriving better than ever, he has never been worse off. And what I'm really looking for is for someone to, address the whole Ida poisoning episode. We don't really talk about it. We jump from Loki finding out about it in the last chapter to him being imprisoned in this one. So did Loki tell Harold and Haradin what happened? And do they just not believe him? Or is this the first step in Loki keeping the truth to himself for reasons that may or may not have something to do with keeping Elbaf united and painting him as the sake of villain for that unity? I don't mind whichever answer it is. I just want to address it because I think it feels weird that we haven't talked about it. Which reminds me that it's time for us to talk about some award-winning flavor via the sponsor of this video, FÜM. FÜM is a flavored air device with no vapor, no nicotine, and no batteries. Just a magnificent flavored air in a super sleek package, relieving daily stresses with deliciousness, as well as wondrous fidgeting technologies. So even if you're not using FÜM for the peak flavored experience, mate, you can fidget with it into infinity. Because my god, NL, the tactile sensation of all the magnets and the clickies, it is out of this world. And of course, you can endlessly personalize your FÜM with the flavor of your choice, including black licorice, to give you that overwhelming sensation of becoming a silhouette on a chair. It's a very specific flavor. I highly recommend it, especially since FÜM has already helped over 700,000 FÜMans develop better habits. And you can too by checking out FÜM using my link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen. And right now, if you order the Journey Pack using my code GrandLineReview, you will receive a free FÜM Topper. And thank you so much, as always, to FÜM, as it's due to the support of sponsors like them that we are able to bring you the best fictional pirate content possible as often as possible. So definitely check them out, but for now it's back to you. Me. Thanks, me. We now turn to Shanks news, or I guess lack of Shanks news, because there's a rather big development after the time skip to 14 years ago in this chapter, which is the disappearance of one Figurlin Shanks on a failed mission right before he was scheduled to take on the Depths Covenant, which is very lucky for Shanks because we know that after the end of this chapter, if he had taken on that mark, he would have been a slave to Emu. But I guess we're done with that whole thread of intrigue for a while, which is a shame because I was enjoying this, this sort of Shanks flashback. I mean, he'll definitely be back because we know that he was on Elbaf the day that Harold died, but I suppose that Oda is saving the answers to all of the big mysteries for a future Shanks flashback, and maybe something that ties into Roger as well if he keeps up this strategy of compound flashbacks, as in maybe in the future we'll have a year-long flashback that plows all the way through from Joy Boy to Roger to Shanks, Shanks and is based on tracking Luffy's straw hat throughout history. But in any case, the elders, they don't seem hugely concerned about Shanks missing this opportunity. And if I were Emu, I do think I would see this as an upgrade, because now Harold gets to take the spot and I get me some giants. And before everything goes wrong, I just want to say that I love this panel of the 5 elders walking with Harold, and we just see his foot in the shot because, my god, Usopp, just how tall is this building that they're all currently in that Harold can comfortably walk behind them. And the elders, they're all dressed up. They're wearing their special jazzy coats, which is what they do every time they visit Emu. These coats, they seem to be a bit of a formality. That, or maybe it's just real cold inside the empty throne room. But in the last chapter, we saw Harold receive his first mark, making him a devoted blade of God. This is the Shallow's Covenant, the same mark that we saw on Shanks in the bath. And in this chapter, we see Harold going one level up, or I suppose down, with the Depths Covenant. And aesthetically, what this seems to do is add a pair of horns to the original mark, making it unmistakably devilsome, although you wouldn't realize that until it's too late. And what really, really hurts about this scene is hearing Harold's original plan, that he was going to abdicate the throne and hand it over to someone with more purity to properly lead the next era of peace, which is traditionally a narrative thread of villains, you know, the ones who seek to create a pure world that they themselves know they won't be able to live in, largely due to all of the atrocities they've committed to forge it. And personally, I think that's the kind of thread that Sakazuki is hanging on to. He's the kind of man determined to commit all of the sins to make sure that no one else will ever have to after he's successful. So Harold, he's well and truly aware of what he's done, and it gets to me because it reminds me of Ida's words to him much earlier on in the flashback. Ida said, "You have to see things from their eye level, Harold. Nothing in this world is meant to be destroyed," which she said as Harold was doing the Nika dance in the background. Harold hasn't done the Nika dance lately, not since he was a much younger man, and that's because he started doing exactly not what Ida said to do. Particularly with joining forces with the world government, he became an agent of obscure destruction, and he stopped looking at humanity through the eye level of humanity. Previously, Harold would meet and speak with humans directly, but his post-rock strategy has taken him all the way up to Marijois, where he is now looking down upon humanity from a greater height than ever, which isn't to say that he's adopted the attitudes of the world nobles. He's still a pretty decent guy, but he's been trying to see things from the eye level of the world nobles rather than humanity, which is what Ida suggested. And those levels are the difference between food from around the world suddenly appearing to combat the famine on Elbaf and being forced to raise an army of slave giants to go to war. And I'm not saying that there was ever going to be a happy ending with this story. Harold, just as with Rox and Roger, he was just not born at the right time to see the change he desired in the world. It just hurts because Harold managed to accomplish so much more in the long run by believing in Ida's words, and he almost threw it all away by changing his strategy and pursuing the seductive path of increasingly demonic tattoos. And just on that, we have seen Harold's new mark before, we just didn't necessarily know what it meant at the time. In chapter 1140, when we met St. Gilliam for the first time, he is wearing an armband depicting the Depths Covenant. And this is a cute little detail that I didn't notice at the time, but Killingham's tattoo is also on the Denden Mushi that Summers is using to speak with him later on in chapter 1147. I'm sure that Killingham, he has the actual tattoo as well, and wearing the armband, it's more like displaying a military rank so that the Holy Knights don't have to be nude at all times, but they still do need to be nude at some times though, because recall St. Summers. He was summoned to Elbaf in a state of undress, and he was showing a very detailed tattoo that many of us, myself included, that's why I said us, assumed was the mark of the abyss at the time. And now there's quite a bit of talk about this tattoo being the final abyssal covenant. I'm not sure if that's the case though, because it is directly contradicted by the armband that St. Summers wears, which at first looked like a shallow mark, and that would be rather embarrassing for Mr. St. Summers, but later on we do get what I'm gonna call a better look at it, and the mark does look quite different to the Depths Covenant, almost like a variant of the V for Vendetta symbol. You know, V upside down, that's an A, sort of. So this could be an abyssal mark. However, I don't know, I think this could also be a piece of scuffed art from Oda or one of his assistants. Generally, when you've got to zoom in that tightly, one piece just devolves into unintelligible squiggles, and I can't find a clearer shot of it. Rather frustratingly, we do have this panel where the armband would have been very extremely clear in the foreground, but it has been strategically covered up by a sound effect bubble of Summers regenerating. I would be very surprised if Summers had made an abyssal covenant though. He just doesn't seem, what's the word, quote, competent in any way. He's from the same family as Saint Shepherd Jupiter, one of the elder stars, who surely has to have an abyssal covenant, and Summers really does strike me as the less successful Uncle Shepherd in this equation. Meanwhile, we have yet to see any mark on Gunko at all, but her left arm, it does have bandages on it that might be obscuring the mark. Her legs also have bandages as well, so who knows what's happening under there. But Harold, by the end of this chapter, has completed what he pledged to do and became a slave of Emu. As we now know that the Depths Covenant is a step that grants those funky regeneration abilities, but it also means that you cannot disobey a direct order from Emu himself, putting Harold in a state of, I guess, stealth Domi Reversi. He's got all of the powers, none of the freedom, just he doesn't look like a demon. And so, just as with best mate Rox, Harold is now gonna need to be put down. And it's a pretty strong mirror that we're looking into here as well, as instead of Roger and Garp, Harold is trusting Loki and Jarl to get the job done in a good old 2v1. And the really depressing part about this whole situation is that it doesn't seem to have mattered which choice was made. Whether you directly rebel against the world government like Rox, or you cozy up to it like Harold, they've both ended up in more or less the exact same state. And mate, this is gonna be quite the blood-soaked ending as well. You may have forgotten this by now because it happened a long time ago, but we have seen the remains of this battlefield. And when I say remains, I mean remains. Lots of bodies and corpses, as well as the weapons and the damage inflicted by the slaughter of these poor guards. Over 100 giants who are probably going to be killed by Harold, but their deaths blamed on Loki. I believe it was Nami who said that entering Horus Castle was like walking into a graveyard. So we are putting all the pieces of Loki hate together, but that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that Harold publicly announced that Elbaf would be joining the world government right after he completed his last mission. And so from the perspective of all of the everyone else, what Loki did is he killed Harold right before that mission could be completed, and it is therefore entirely Loki's fault that the giants are not living in peace with humanity today, which I'm sure that Loki will be more than happy to take the blame for, because the alternative is revealing what Harold did and thus ruining Ida's dream forever. And we can't do that to Mother, but we should also take a step back and talk about the obvious for a second, which is that in this chapter, there's a fair bit of unfinished artwork. This is extremely unusual for One Piece, so much so that it's only ever happened once before, which was chapter 1098 during Kuma's flashback. And what this unfinished art means is that Oda was unable to meet his deadline, and whatever was available just had to go to print. So in the Kuma flashback, some people even thought that this was a stylistic choice to show Kuma's world breaking down because the unfinished artwork came right after Ginny's death. And it is, I guess, coincidentally fascinating that the only other time this has happened since then was to Harold right after Ida's death, I suppose showing his world crumbling down. So two very poignant flashback moments that were not intended to be poignant. And I guarantee you it is definitely not on purpose. Oda does not want to be putting these pages out if he can help it, but I imagine that the only options here were to either put the chapter out as is, or to take an emergency break week to have the time to fix things up. And that is probably what triggers a lot of Oda's unscheduled breaks, but the more he does that, the further he pushes back One Piece as a whole. And Oda, he's really trying to speed up and stay on schedule here. And in the end, it's not a big deal because these panels will be fixed for the volume release. Always remember that what gets released in Weekly Shonen Jump is a glorified draft. The art, and more importantly, the dialogue of what we're reading weekly in this magazine does frequently and impactfully change for the volume releases, which is why we go over all of that on this channel as well when they come out. For now though, look, this chapter, it is 3 weeks in a row of One Piece, so I'm just happy that there is a chapter regardless of its state, although it does make me worry about how far Oda may be pushing himself to make that happen. But I do love how this chapter ends with the narrator essentially saying, and now we go back to the story that we started telling but got sidetracked for 3 months, and we will finally now tell it. The tragedy of Harold. And it really does look as if we are ending this year in one of the most depressing ways possible, with Oda gift wrapping Harold's severed head and presenting it to us for Christmas. But you let me know what you thought of the chapter in the comments below. And if you're in the mood for some long-form One Piece content, then please do check out the Calm Belt. It's a whole channel where GrandLineReview videos are compiled into 2 to 3 hour compilations, which also feature videos that for one reason or another never made it onto this channel. Curious, yes. And these are for you to have on while you're sleeping, drawing, gaming, or whatever other long-form activities you perform. So definitely check that out through the link in the description. And thank you so much again to FÜM for sponsoring this video, and definitely check them out through the link in the description.